So hello friends, and welcome back for week 11 in the Monday video series for Introduction to Biblical Languages. This week we're going to push a little bit deeper into our understanding of how verbs work, as always beginning with the particular verbal function or language aspect within English, and then extending that across to Biblical Hebrew, and then finally looking at the same kind of verbal activity in terms of New Testament Greek. Today we're going to be introducing the topic of mood, verbal mood, and voice. So let's jump into it. In some ways we're not adding lots and lots of new material, but in another way we are just skating on the top of the ice, and there's obviously a lot of information and a lot of learning which would need to be done in relation to the different forms, verbal forms, to do with mood and voice. We're just doing a high-level introduction so that when the accordance software tells you that a particular word is a verb of a particular type, you then have enough information to know how you're going to deal with it and work with it. So we started out 2 weeks ago now looking at the overall verb systems, getting a sense of how they work and what they're doing and how important they are within sentences and paragraphs. Last week we looked at tense, time, and aspect. And this week we're going to look at mood and voice. And then next week we'll wrap up with the verb material by looking at infinitives and participles. So let's have a look at how mood and voice function in English. We'll start with voice because that's the simplest thing for us to be dealing with. Voice is simply active voice, middle voice, passive voice, and is to do with the relationship between the verb and the subject. So if the subject is the one doing the action, then we're talking about active voice. If the subject is the one, if the verb is focusing on the subject, but the subject is both doing the action but in a sense also caught up in the result of the action, then we call it middle voice. And if it's passive, then that's where the verb is talking about an action which happens to the subject, where the subject is not, in a sense, the person undertaking the action, but nonetheless they're the recipient or the beneficiary of the action in the verb. So active, normal tense of the verb. Middle, when there's something complicated going on. Passive, when somebody else or some other force is at work, but nonetheless it's impacting on me. So voice, that's relatively simple, I hope. When it comes to mood, we're talking about the relationship between the verb and reality. Okay? Is something actually happening in front of us right now? If you want a little bit of a discussion of that, you can look up Greek for the rest of us, pages 26 through to 28. So the indicative mood, which is what we've been focusing on in terms of Greek, for example, and the same applies in English, the indicative is dealing with real action that's actually going on, whether it's in the past, the present, or the future. It's something that you can see and observe and perform. So I eat, he ate, they will eat. These are all examples of the indicative mood. Just basically reflecting, indicating what's going on right in front of us, as it were. Subjunctive is talking about action which possibly is going to occur but is not happening in front of us in real time. So possible action. I might want to do that later. I might go to see a movie. I may have vegetables for dinner. If I were really, da 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 da. So These are expressing a wish, an expectation, a possibility, but not describing actions that are underway, as it were. The imperative is the form of the verb used to give a command. Do this, take that, go here, sit, wait. All of these are examples of the imperative, and it's the mood of the verb, again, not describing something which is happening at the moment, but indicating something which needs to happen, must happen, and which you are instructing to occur. And then we look at infinitive and participle, which we'll come back to next week. And the infinitive is, in English, the infinitive is expressed by putting to in front of the verb. To eat, to drink, to walk, to talk, to read, to sleep, etc. And it's a form of the verb that has no limits put on it in terms of person and number and tense and so on. It's simply even like a absolute form of the verb, and we'll see that it's used in particular ways next week when we come back and look at the infinitive. And similarly, participle is quite common, as I think we saw a couple of weeks ago with the pie charts. Participle is quite common, particularly when it comes to New Testament Greek. In English, it's usually expressed in certainly a present participle would be expressed by putting ing on the end of the verb. I am eating, I am drinking, I'm talking, or past tense, I was eating, I was driving, I was dreaming, etc. Okay, and we'll see that participles can be used by putting an article in front, and you make a participial phrase, and it's a very common form we're going to run into. Now, when we transfer those sorts of dynamics of language across into Biblical Hebrew, we're starting to run in again to our friends from the Binyamin, okay, the different forms of the different conjugations, if you like, of the Hebrew verb. So we've got kal, which notice is a simple active form of the verb. So it's kind of like indicative active in terms of what we were just discussing. The nifal is passive, but it's a simple sense of the verb, but it's passive or reflexive. Can be either. So that would be either passive or middle in terms of the categories we were just using. The PL introduces the idea that something is repetitive or being intensified, and this is more to do with aspect than with mood or voice. We talked about aspect last week. Pual is passive, hence the voice part coming in, but it's the passive form of the PL, so it's still to do with something which is intensified or repeated, made more powerful, but now it's in the passive sense. Hifel is causative, to cause something to happen. We don't really have a direct equivalent to that in English, but it is a fairly important and common form in Biblical Hebrew. Hafel is causative, but it's passive causative. So we've moved from, if you like, the active voice, causative, with the hifel. We've moved to the passive form, passive voice with the hafel. And then when we've got hithpael, it's passive voice, but it's really intensified, and if you like, the power of the verb has been really turned up a couple of notches. Passive, but still we're in the passive. So we've got a voice element, passive, as well as a verbal aspect, the intensified dimension. Now we'll come in a moment. We'll just briefly note that Hebrew also has three other forms which are to do with expressing a wish, in other words, a volition: cohortative, imperative, and jussive. And we'll notice we've already seen imperative in English, and we'll see imperative in Greek. But before we go there, let's just have another look at the Binyamin. Okay, so this is a little table that some people have found helpful, and it's basically it's picking up the metaphor of the menorah, and it's allocating the forms of the verb, the different constructions or binyanim, the different buildings across the different candles of the menorah. So on the left hand side of the menorah we have active, on the right hand side of the menorah we have passive, so this is tying into our discussion of voice, and in the middle, the candle in the middle is reflexive, or in English terms, middle, and it's in the middle, so that kind of makes sense. Okay, and then we've got simple, intensive, and causative. Okay, and there's both a active and a passive form of each of those. So some people find that a helpful way to just not so much to memorize it with the level of language learning we're doing, but at least to just have a map to see. I can see what's going on here, but I'm not going to get my head around it in detail at this stage. Okay, and this comes from a Wikipedia page on modern Hebrew verbs, but it does also have application to biblical Hebrew. So the volitional forms that I mentioned, if it's first person, basically these are different nuances of the imperative. At least that's how I would understand it in my own little brain. So cohortative is when we're expressing a request, we're making a resolution, or we're exhorting ourselves basically to do something, encouraging ourselves to do something. And cohortative only applies to the first person. Let me speak, allow me to speak, I'm going to do this, or if it's plural, first person plural, let's do this. Cohortative. The direct simple form of the imperative in Hebrew is only used for the second person, either singular or plural, and it's issuing a command, it's making a request, it's offering advice, or it's interjecting. Go from here, head straight down there, whatever. Vindicate me, O Lord. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, listen to me. And then the jussive form, the jussive label, is used for a third person volitional form. Again, it's very similar to the imperative. It's a command, it's a request, it's permission, but it's referring to the third person. Let there be, may the Lord, let me do this, and so on. So you'll find these coming up in the tags, in your instant details and accordance. Whether it's cohortative or imperative or jussive, there's simply different ways of expressing a wish. It's a combination of what in Greek we're going to see in a moment is expressed either through the subjunctive or the imperative moods. Okay, and the software will be our best friend in those cases. So let's have a look at voice and then mood in New Testament Greek. So if it's active, as we've already said with English, the subject is the one doing the action, and there are two sets of personal endings. One we're fairly familiar with now, o, eis, a, omen, ete, usi, and there's a secondary set of endings which we've noticed for things like imperfect and second aorist that are on, es, e, omen, ete, on. Okay, and verbs that are built in that way are active voice. If it's middle voice, the verb is going to have an ending like omai, esai, etai, ometha, este, ontai. That's not too big a stretch to recognize that ometha is we and S that is the middle form of you. But it is quite a different set of endings. We're not going to be learning those endings, okay? We're just going to rely on the software. So if it's a middle form of the verb, then the subject is engaged in the action in a way that they're caught up in it, rather than simply being the subject who does the action to someone or something else, okay? Active is I'm doing it. Middle is I'm doing it, but I'm actually part of what is happening and I'm caught up in the action in some sense. And then passive, someone else is doing it, but I'm the one who's the person impacted. And again, there's a different set of personal endings for passive verbs. Some overlap with the middle and passive forms, but if you see a verb ending in omen, u, eto, with the s there on top, then you'll be very grateful for the software, which is going to tell you what's going on. These are not things to be learning other than to learn the concept that there are going to be active forms of the verb, middle forms of the verb, and passive forms of the verb. Okay, the software will look after the rest for us. We have to have the mental framework so that when Accordance says this is middle or this is passive, we know what that implies. Okay, so the way the verbs are built in Greek is if we start with voice, the action is either going to be an active action, a middle, or a passive. Okay, this chart I'm about to put up has been adapted from Duff, Elements of New Testament Greek. For each of the voices, there are a range of moods. So we can have indicative, which is the most common, but we can also have imperative and infinitive and participle and subjunctive. These are not describing what's actually happening in front of us, as it were, but they're other dimensions, a different relationship to reality, because they're expressing commands or wish or whatever. And then in terms of tenses, the indicative mood is going to flow across, whether it's active, middle, or passive. The indicative is going to be expressed through a whole range of tenses, okay? And that's partly to do with time, but as we saw last week, it's also to do with aspect, whether it's undefined verbal action, whether it's continuous action, or whether it's perfected or completed action. The non-indicative forms of the verb have access to a limited array of tenses, including present, aorist, and perfect. And there's still a degree of aspect coming through in those cases. So an imperative, which is present, implies I want you to do this, and it's an action which is going to be ongoing. Whereas an imperative aorist is implying I just want you to do it, and I'm not commenting on whether it's a repetitive action and so on. Okay, so that kind of a map might help you just get a bit of a mind map, as it were, in terms of the verbal patterns. So looking at this in the real life, as it were, the indicative is real action. Sorry, got ahead of myself there. The indicative is real action, and in terms of our demo verb, luo, it's going to be luo, and this is actually looking at the principal parts of the verb. So luo is present indicative, luso is future, elewon is imperfect, elusa is aorist, leluka is perfect, and luomai is middle or passive, just to give you a bare bones kind of summary. So subjunctive and imperative verbs we're going to find in the list that follows only occur in the present tense and the aorist tense, whereas infinitives and participles can also occur in the perfect tense. So when we look at the subjunctive, we're talking about something which might happen. Perhaps it's desirable that it happen. We'd like to encourage it. It might be happening as a consequence, a result of something else. It might be done in order to achieve something else. So the present tense of subjunctive is going to be expressed as luo, lues, lue, luomen, luet, luete, luosi, and one of the things that's typical of the subjunctive is that the vowels in the personal endings are lengthening, and there's also iota subscripts in the second singular, third person singular. When we move it across to the aorist, one of the things that's changed is that in the outside of the indicative we no longer have the augment on the front. So it becomes luso, luces, lucei, lusomen, lucete, lusosi. When we come to imperative, so this is second person singular, third person singular, second person plural, third person plural, then it's going to be luet in the present imperative, luet, luetto, luetet, luetosan, and in the aorist imperative it's going to be luson, lusato, lusate, and lusatosan. Okay. And then looking briefly at infinitive and participle. So the infinitive is a kind of a hybrid between a verb and a noun, and looking at it in its present, aorist and perfect forms, it's going to be luane, lusai, the aorist, and lelucanai, the perfect infinitive form. And there's no he, she, we, they, you, okay? It's infinitive. It's just without that prescription. And with participles, we get again a hybrid form of the verb, which is as much verb as adjective. And it's going to be built by having the verb stem, the tense infix that we've seen previously, like the sigma alpha for aorist, and then the case endings. And the case endings, of course, is where the adjective aspect comes in. This is a form of the verb we'll look at next week, which is going to include nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, in both singular and plural form. And as you can see in the way we write it out in the three forms, participles also reflect gender. So we have masculine, feminine, and neuter. So the way we would learn those or list them is luon, luusa, luon, and then they're going to kind of drop down like a pop-down menu with the different forms. That's the present participle. If it's an aorist participle, you notice you've got the sigma alpha coming in. So the nominative singular forms are going to be lusas, lusasa, and lusan. And if it's perfect, again, notice the duplication on the front and also the presence of the kappa. So lelukos, leluquia, lelukos, or lelukos. And again, just dunk, the genitive, the accusative, the nominative, the accusative, genitive, dative, singular, plural, and so on. So we've just put a whole lot of trees instead of just noticing the forest, but part of this is just to give that sense that there are patterns here which we are not going to try to learn, but Accordance has all those patterns already coded into the tagging, and they will tell us whether something is subjunctive, whether it's a participle, if it's a participle, whether it's present, aorist, or perfect, whether it's masculine, feminine, neuter, and also what case it is. So the software really is a fantastic tool for us. Okay, of course, sometimes life gets a little bit complicated, and there are verbs that only occur, as it were, in the middle or passive form, and they don't have a present indicative active form. It just doesn't exist. And these verbs have traditionally been called deponent verbs, and it used to be explained that they have the middle or passive form, but they have an active meaning. Certainly they have a middle or passive form, and that's because they are in fact middle and passive verbs. But when we translate them into English, these verbs tend to have an active sense, because there's something, and these are verbs where basically the person doing the action is necessarily involved in the action, and so although it's a middle or passive form, in English it would just have an active meaning. And there are a number of examples of fairly common deponent verbs: apokrinomai, I answer; dunamai, I'm able; urkamai, I come or I go; pariuamai, another verb for come or go; ginamai, I am and or to become, I become; and for eomai, I'm afraid. Now, as you can hopefully see straight away, these are all verbs that are about the subject. If I'm answering, then it is me who is answering. So in the Greek, they are written and they occur in the middle form, but in English we don't say I myself answer, we just say I answer, he answered, you were answering, etc. Okay, so you will sometimes get a reference to deponent verbs. It's a little wrinkle in the paper we really don't need to worry about in terms of what we're doing in this subject. But in fact, some grammars don't even talk about deponent as a verbal category any longer. Okay, although they have a middle or passive form, they're simply verbs that are translated with active meaning. So, working with imperative verbs, firstly, there's no first person form of the imperative in Greek. That's going to be handled in Greek by using the subjunctive. Okay. The other thing to be aware of is that the second person plural forms, you plural, imperative, are written exactly the same way as the present indicative, and we'll have a good example of that occurs in John chapter 14, a very familiar passage. We'll have a look at that in just a moment. So the imperative present is looking at actions, something we're giving a command or an instruction, and it has that element of ongoing, repeated action. I want you to do this, and I want you to basically keep on doing it over and over again. Okay. I think an example might be that section in the Sermon on the Mount, ask, seek, and knock. It's really keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. So the second person form of the imperative present is keep on going. Start this and continue with it. Don't just do it the once. And the third person present tense is not so much giving permission as giving a construction that impacts a third person. So I might be saying it to you, but it's going to involve somebody else. He, she, they must keep going. If it's the aorist form of the imperative, then it's simply an undefined action. It doesn't mean it is a one-time thing, but the action is not being defined. We're just getting the simple form of the action. Second person aorist is go, on your way, get going. Okay? And the third person would be they must go, let them go. They need to get moving. Okay? But not necessarily implying that it's repetitive, but also not implying that it's a one-time only action. Now in class on Wednesday night we will have a look at the first couple of sentences, first couple of verses, I guess, in John chapter 14. I just want to draw your attention to pistuete up here. So pistuete is you believe, pistuo, and then ete, and then we've got the same thing down here. Okay, all right. So you might want to think a little bit about that paragraph before Wednesday night. Have a look at it in English, have a look at it in a couple of different translations. What is going on there? And are those verbs, pistuete, are they present tense indicative verbs, or are they present imperative verbs? Okay, so have a look at that. You can use your interlinear, you can use the instant details box, but have a little bit of a think about the forms of the verbs that we find in John chapter 14, verses 1 to 4. Okay, a little bit of thinking about subjunctive verbs. Subjunctive has been defined by one of the grammars as the mood of probability. I think that was Croy's Greek grammar used that phrase, the mood of probability. It's where we express ideas of contingency, uncertainty, doubt, expectation, volition, intention, desire, hypothetical or potential situations. In other words, it's not actually happening, but we'd like it to, or we're worried that it might, or we think it might be a consequence of, or it needs to be done in order for something else to happen. So it's to do with things which may not have happened or may happen in the future, rather than the indicative sense of the action. Again, these are things that are uncertain but probable. So subjunctive. Wouldn't it be good if, and in English often the subjunctive is expressed with forms of the verb like would and could and should. The software will of course identify the mood and tell us this is a subjunctive verb, and it will also give us the person, number, tense and voice. So all the details are there. We just have to understand that subjunctive is not like future tense indicative. It is a different mood, a different kind of perspective on the action. When it's the first person plural, it's more of the sense of let us do something. That's so-called hortatory sense, similar to what we saw in biblical Hebrew. It's also used in questions and prohibitions, and it's used to express purpose and result, and often a clause that has a verb in the subjunctive. If it's to do with purpose and result, quite often that clause will begin with hinna. And another way of saying that is when you see hinna occurring at the beginning of a clause, almost certainly the verb that's following it, either directly or later in the clause, the verb that's connected with hinna is most likely going to be subjunctive. But again, we don't have to master all these details. The software is going to do it for us. So that's all we're doing with mood and voice. It's worth going through it a couple of times perhaps and just reviewing and revising the material. And I'd certainly encourage you to have a look at the first couple of verses of John 14 and look at the different ways that verbs are used in that paragraph. In terms of the week ahead, so we've got this video, which is our introduction to mood and voice. On Wednesday night, we'll go over some of this material. We'll also look at ancient Jewish practices related to the divine name, and we'll do a little bit of further work extending our accordance software skills. There's no new vocabulary to be learned, but of course you might want to learn those deponent verbs, for example. You certainly would be well advised to do some revision of the 100 vocab items. We've now completed the 10 weekly exercises. So that's behind us. That's one less thing to worry about this week. No more weekly exercises by Sunday evening. But we still have our additional reading, and the additional reading, as usual, ties in with our cultural knowledge. In this case, it's a really interesting online article, a blog post basically, by Larry Hurtado, on writing and pronouncing the divine name in Second Temple Jewish tradition. Second Temple is a kind of an adjective that's meaning the temple around the time of Jesus, so from the post-exilic period down to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in 70 CE. That period of several hundred years is called the Second Temple period. So Larry Hurtado's article is looking at what's the evidence for how Jewish people in the Second Temple period wrote or pronounced the divine name. I hope you find it a really enjoyable article. Okay, that's it for this video. I look forward to seeing you in class on Wednesday, online at least on Wednesday. And again, as always, if you've got any questions, please reach out to either Chris or myself and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. Thanks.